James, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Awesome. Arkady will be joining us. I don't know if he's coming on late or what, but
Yeah.
um, excited for this. So just so everybody understands, and I usually have a pre-show screen, but the problem is that was the first time we're trying it on YouTube. So there you
Uh,
go. Um, so uh, so just so everybody knows. Oh, there's Arkady. So just so everybody knows who James is. James, can you do a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll get into what kind of brought this about.
sure. Yeah. So my name is James Anderson. I am a senior manager of sales engineering at Snowflake. I cover major accounts in New England. And before I was at Snowflake, I actually worked for another consulting firm doing Snowflake implementations for quite a few years. So
I didn't know
been
that.
oh yeah, been on
That's
been
cool.
on both sides of the equation at this point.
You've
That's
been on
awesome.
both the dark side and the light side.
I won't let you. I won't say who's dark and who's light at this point. Everybody's on the same team in my mind.
That's
we're
right.
all on the same team here.
That's right.
So here's what ended up bringing us together. Arkady, we had put together a data maturity webinar that Arkady was hosting, and James and his team said, "Hey, we're actually really talking about this topic," and it sort of started this, I would say a 2 month chain of emails about what it is to be a mature Snowflake implementation, and what the stages might look like when you're going and through those stages of maturity. And it's interesting, there are some differences to what I perceived and what their team perceived, but I thought that would make a really good podcast, and us just kind of talking about what are some of the elements that create maturity. And I think one of the main things we did agree on is that there really is no such thing as an actual, you're going to do this and then this and then this and then this, and it's always going to appear that way for every client. It's just not the reality of it, right? So so let's just start with where would you say, James, the first stage typically lands? If we're just going to, again, admitting up front that there's no such thing as a normal, everyday scenario, but as we look at the aggregate, where does the first step usually stand?
Yeah, I mean, it really involves a customer's first foray into Snowflake, and there are a couple of different types of customers who do that. Some are very on-premise based at the time, and Snowflake is their first real cloud purchase that they've made. They have these huge Teradata stacks, or they have they've been an Oracle or SAP shop for years and years and years, and they're finally getting around to, hey, it's time to move to the cloud, time to think about that. And my experience, people who are very on-premise focused, they have their applications on-premise, they got their databases on-premise, they got it all, and they decide, what, the safest thing for us to do is to build an analytics environment in the cloud, because if it doesn't work, if it doesn't do what we want, we haven't ripped up somebody's day-to-day operations. We've built a playground, we've built something for people to have fun in, but it's an investment that we're gonna kind of try out. And so those customers usually, we bucket all these kind of first capacity deals into this kind of new bucket where they're new to Snowflake. It's usually around one line of business. They've made a purchase for a particular workload type, and they're having some fun, right? And the other side of that is a super cloud friendly company who's been in the cloud, been in AWS, Azure, GCP for years and years and years and years and years, but have finally decided, what, I think Snowflake needs to be a core component to our overall sort of cloud infrastructure, and it's going to bring a lot of value.
So there's two sides. There's either one that's like totally new to the cloud, or there's one that's really cloud centric, but wants a better experience.
Yeah, and either way, we bucket those as new customers because they are new to Snowflake, and Snowflake is an incredibly simple to use platform, right? Anybody can go to snowflake.com and spin up a trial account today. You'll get $400 in free credits, and you can go play around with Snowflake immediately. And I like in Snowflake, I like to use this analogy. I don't know if you ever played the board game Othello.
Sure.
No, I haven't.
Arkady knows what I'm talking about.
Yes.
And right there on the box it says simple to learn, lifetime to master.
Yes.
And I liken Snowflake to like the game of Othello, where it's very simple to pick up and learn, but to really get the value out of it, it takes time, it takes energy, it takes an understanding of all of the bells and whistles and capability that Snowflake provides. So even if you're a super cloud friendly, right, and you've been using AWS, if you're somebody who was born in the cloud, like Snowflake, right, if you're a company that was born in the cloud, it still takes some time to get your deployment stood up, to get the right patterns, the right ingestion patterns of the data, the right ELT patterns in Snowflake, the right networking to connect into Snowflake. We obviously take security very seriously, so making sure that you've gone through the security checklist and made all the decisions you need to make to get up on Snowflake.
One thing that's interesting about that example, the Othello example, is that if you think about the origins of Snowflake, the very first implementations that people were doing, it was a lot of startup companies. It was a lot of companies that were really small. Well, I shouldn't say small. Nobody knew their name, but they would have like these massive data footprints, and then you'd go uncover it. It's like, holy cow, these people have a ton of data, but they wanted to start with something that they could adopt easily. And it wasn't all ones that had big data sets. There were plenty that were just small, wanted to something easy to start with, and it was easy. I mean, it was easy for them to do.
And those were quite interesting because, again, those were not only early adopters, those were also folks who were willing to innovate and start something. They were starting from scratch. And so a lot of mature companies are asking us many times, how do I have that mentality? How do I bring that into my development environment? Sort of that barbarian stage startup mentality, even though I might be a 100-year-old company. But with Snowflake, that was a big deal because it gave them the ability to compete against technologies that it would have been much more difficult to initially deploy and start with.
Yeah, and a lot of those companies probably didn't have huge IT departments who would manage that infrastructure for them, right? That what they needed was a platform that is mostly managed for them, and all they have to do is turn the knobs and tweak the dials and bring the data themselves and start to derive value out of their data. And the thing on our side that really precipitated this conversation around maturity and how do we think about a customer's maturity is what is the ultimate end state? And there's two components to that, right? And I'll get to the data cloud journey on the second part of this, because that's really where Snowflake has accelerated in the last year or so, is really becoming that data cloud and the vision of the data cloud. But even before that, a lot of these companies, to your point, Arkady, they were small companies, but they had massive data sets because they recognized that their data were assets. This isn't just a tool for decision making.
Yeah, it's
right?
factory floor.
Exactly. This is an asset that needs to be measured as such. So, for us, when we were thinking about what does a mature customer really look like, it's a customer who has shifted their mindset that from my data is a tool that helps make decisions, to my data are assets, and I'm measuring how we're working with our data in an ROI fashion. And I am making investments in my data set, in my data, and in the platforms that support my data in a way that's measured in the same way that I might measure a server rack, right? It should be the exact same thing. And so a lot of these initial companies had this data, recognized that they were assets, and said, I need a platform that's going to help me maximize my ROI on those assets. And initially with Snowflake, it was maximizing the ROI because I didn't need huge, suites of cloud engineers or huge big consulting firms to come in and do massive implementations. I needed a strategic partner who could come in, help me to build out my deployment. And I needed a small team of data geeks who were just passionate about this to run the platform, because everything else was being run by us.
One thing that's interesting about that, you know, the change in mindset of how you perceive your data. I wrote a white paper. This is years back. It was when we were doing a lot of services for startups because of this.
Hmm.
What I was noticing is that, you know, the typical spend for a company that is trying to, you know, get into the realm of really turning data into information. I mean, they're gonna the floor. If you're really going to turn it into information, you're going to be spending somewhere in the $200,000 range to start to get in there. You know,
Mhm.
and you know, and so for companies that are startups, you know, sometimes they don't have the budgets for that. But what I started realizing is that as you get to company size of somewhere around $200 million, they can justify that investment. But there's something that broke that equation for me. And it was companies that used data for their factory floor. In other words, data was running a critical process for them.
Mhm.
And I think this thing you just mentioned, you know, it kind of plays into that and it turns out that you could almost make a justification for data being part of any company's factory floor
Mhm.
once you get past sort of the belief that we're just hand moving widgets around. That data is actually an operational piece to the business. And when we get to that level, what I started to realize is that these startups, even though they were spending that kind of money, the reason they were spending it is because they saw it as the factory floor. You know, if we're making something for our clients, we need to invest in that something.
Yeah.
And that's what we were seeing anyway.
Yeah. No, it's 100% the case. And even now, right, we have new customers that come on board every day, big, small, you know, with some of the biggest companies in the world are sitting in that new bucket, because they've realized that Snowflake is providing a lot of value to them, right? And we've shifted as a company and as a platform away from just, hey, this is a great place to store your data and process your data and work with your data, to we've created a data network and a data cloud that, you know, you can see it over my shoulder here on this side, on this lovely visual, right? This is our sort of the visual of our data cloud and the nodes that happens between different companies and different platforms. And there are companies who have invested a huge amount in putting their data out on the marketplace because that's now a revenue stream. Right. And so new customers are coming on board to be enabled in the data cloud, right? So the business value that we really see for those companies is, okay, you've got on board and this marketplace is instantly unlocked for you, right? There's hundreds and hundreds of data sets that exist out in the data marketplace today.
And this was part of the quandary that we had in putting this list together, is because one of our steps is the use of this you know, data cloud, but we've seen people join and start using it like right out of the gate.
Exactly.
Yeah. And people, and it is to be fair, on the sales side, it's a phenomenal selling tool for us. It's such an easy way to get somebody to at least get their feet wet, right? We have a big customer here in New England who, you know, their first foray was because the Star Schema COVID-19 data set was out there, and they said, you know what, that's a data set that's important to us. And we're going to do a small sort of pilot deal to play around with that data. Right. And that's how we got in the door. And so it's a really great wedge piece, but you're only at the tip of the iceberg. Right. And so you're great. You're enabled in the data cloud, but really at the end, what we call sort of the final phase, and I'm going to go through all the phases, I promise, but you know, the final phase is we call it the modernizing phase. And really the business value is that you've gone through a digital transformation and you've realized the value of the data cloud. You've gotten to that data cloud realization phase, because not only are you taking in data sets, but you are actively participating at that point in sharing data with your partners, with your customers. You might have data published out on the marketplace yourself. You might have generated new revenue streams that you didn't even know existed all the way back at sort of that new phase. And I bring up the end because I think the next step after new is what we call organizing. And really what that is okay, we've gotten our feet wet. We've brought on a couple of workloads, maybe, we've got something into production. How do we organize ourselves around Snowflake as an organization, right? How do we think about expanding the usage of Snowflake outside of this line of business that may have made the purchase of Snowflake initially, right, and moved out to other places? How do we organize our thoughts around how Snowflake is being used? How do we organize our COE model and our enablement model around that? And this is where the value of a partner is so important, because companies like Intricity are bringing data strategy capabilities to the table that my sales engineers aren't necessarily bringing.
One thing that helps us too is you start because one of the things that Snowflake has is the scale is very broad. I mean, it's so broad. And so what you start to realize is that you need to sort of organize the use cases in ways that are meaningful to the business and that fit the data use case too. Like, you need a place for the data to reside where there's not too much logic written against it, so that it constrains, say, someone wanting to do lab work, a data science type. But then at the same time, there is such thing as information. There is such thing as a customer and a product and a, fill in the blank. And that stuff does need some conformity, and business people shouldn't have to rebuild that logic every single time they want to do a query. And so what you start to see is the need to design this framework that talks about this organization and conformity.
We call it the data fabric or the data factory, but both of you raised a couple of critically important points to the data cloud, and sort of the ability to recognize that you can pick up a data share. You talked, James, about COVID data and the customer being able to use that. Think about the alternative, because I think we talk about sort of the magic of this, but the alternative would be inertia. It would be, maybe I can't start this project because how do I get this data? How do I bring it in? How do I transform it? How do I load it? There is a whole project just to get the raw materials in the door before you could start manufacturing those widgets or those analytics that you'd like to manufacture. The other side that I think both of you touched on that's critically important is I can't think of a single customer where the question of what do we do first? How do we start? What's the first thing that we do? Which subject area, which business domain do we focus on? And Jared, I've brought up the cat herders toolkit a bunch of times to customers, because it's difficult sometimes, because there are folks, they're driving, they're on the road, they're driving, but they don't necessarily know the destination they're going into and what passengers they need to pick up along the way.
And one difference, James, that I have from the way you guys organize it is that I seem to have like new to cloud as sort of its own distinct step, but I actually separate out the migration phase as its own step, because we see those as such milestone projects for some of these companies to actually migrate at least what they've got in terms of logic, right? So this concept of turning data into, fabricating it back into information, which needs to be done as part of organizing. A lot of organizations have already done that work. They've dumped a ton of money, in some cases 20 years worth of logic into the existing architectures that they have, and they realize that Snowflake is going to be a better place to be. And so those projects there's an entire industry that's been built literally over the last 3 years around this.
Oh yeah, 100%.
It's amazing.
And I coming from the professional services side, all we wanted to do was, hey, we want to get these migration projects, because that is a big meaty project, right? And and it's important. And what I'll say now that I'm on the Snowflake side is that yes, migrations are critically important. And I understand why it's an entire bucket in itself in what you're looking at, Jared.
Yeah.
Why we don't look at it is because because if companies can get stuck in a migration,
Yeah.
an ineffective migration is a killer for your progression through your maturity, right? If you get stuck in a huge migration and you're just not getting the value, right?
The value statement can't be after the migration. It needs to be in parallel.
Exactly. Yep. And so by for me, migration is a big part of that organizing area. And we talked a lot about it, internally about where does migration really fit here. And for us, it's right in that organizing area, because I've spent a lot of time with customers who are in the middle of a migration and say, I cannot think about what's next until this is done. I can't distract myself. I can't distract anybody on this. I have too much money riding on retiring what I have on premise and coming onto Snowflake. So don't even talk to me.
Yeah.
What that says to us is, okay, we need to now organize ourselves as a sales team or an account team, right? We need to get ourselves organized around, once this is finished, we may have done some of the work for you and gone out to the business and helped you to sell Snowflake as a solution for them for their business problems moving forward. And so once they can pull their head out of the quagmire from a migration perspective and say, okay, we're done. Now what? Yeah. We say, well, let us tell you here's the backlog, right? And let's do some of that organizing for you. And that's something that we do as a sales team. That's something I would imagine that you as a partner would do outside of what you're doing with the migration.
Well, before we usually do a migration, is we will map out all of the parallel tasks, right? So migration is a piece of a much broader vision. We actually don't do migrations before we have a future state architecture in plan, in literally like a blueprint in front of who's there. The reason for that is because migrations can be very distracting. But what we want to do is make sure that the parallel lines of success are defined, because to be honest, in most cases, the data that is represented inside of these older systems, these older MPP databases, they don't represent all the data. They represent kind of a slice of very conformed data. The rest of the data is like, there's a ton of stuff there. I mean, it's a ton of stuff. It's a very small slice that's actually in the MPP database in comparison to all of the semi-structured data and all of these other points that can be brought in, and understanding which departments gain from those make it so that we're not just siloed in the MPP store.
And many times that data is not, as you said, Jared, conformed. Many times that data represents a bunch of silos that were built because of applications, either aligned by application or aligned by business unit. Let's be clear. The reason that folks embark on a migration, typically we see two primary reasons. One is risk mitigation. My platform is end of life. I've got scalability issues. I've got reliability issues. Those are the things that are pushing me in that direction. The other, and hopefully the two sort of come together, is the ability to get cost savings and speed and agility as you move on to this new platform. And so exactly as you said, Jared, if we get stuck in sort of this organizing phase, we're missing the bigger picture, which is, are we leveraging the data assets that we're moving into this new platform, or do we just get a better, faster engine, but the car remains the same?
Well, it's interesting you both say that, because I'll tell you, in our kind of business value matrix of each of these phases, the business value that you get out of the organizing phase is eliminating silos, right? The goal of that is to identify and understand, how do we eliminate and break down these silos? And then once you've done that, you move into that next phase, which we call expanding. And the value there is about data democratization, and about let's not just provide the same car with a better engine. Let's provide a better car and give more people access to that car, and give in obviously a very safe and secure way, so that you're not exposing yourself to data, people with malicious intent, or giving access to data that people shouldn't have. But the more you can democratize your data and your data assets and your data services, the better. And so why we call it expanding is because it's really about expanding out of the sort of core area of the business that you've been in and expanding to everybody else, right? Getting all these different business units on board. And what that does for our customers is it breaks down communication silos even, right? And this then leads to a whole conversation about a COE model and are you doing a very centralized COE model? Are you doing a very kind of decentralized COE model, or are you somewhere in that sort of hub and spoke model where you have a central team and all that? But at the end of the day, if the marketing team is doing this one type of model on customer information, and the sales team is building a model on customer information that fundamentally does the same thing, but there's no communication between those two teams, it's going to take each of them 6 months or whatever it is to build those models themselves. And then all of a sudden they're gonna be like, oh, wait, between the two of us, we did the same thing. What are we doing here? We could have been working on something different over here. So you're not only democratizing the data, you're democratizing the data services, and you're democratizing what type of data is available and democratizing the usage of that data as a whole. And at that point, establishing that COE model becomes super critical for us and for our customers, because if you don't have a good, and I'm going to say the word that's the third rail of data consulting, if you don't have good governance on top of this platform, you're I never even touch governance projects. It just wasn't for me.
Yeah, I hear you.
But if you don't have that, if you haven't built a good governance system from a COE perspective on top of your Snowflake deployment, it's going to be really difficult to actually get a cohesive plan and strategy across the board.
I like that mostly because, and in our world, that sort of comes part and parcel of consolidating, and
conforming.
Conforming. You've got to conform the modeling and the planning, the dimensionality of the data. You have to conform this stuff. You don't want everybody duplicating the same work over and over and over again. And so there's a method to that madness. And it does involve getting in meetings. And it's not actually, if you have the right person running those meetings, it can go really well, like incredibly well. We've seen that. Arkady's very good at these. And it can be exciting. Like it's fun to see users get excited about this because they start to see what they're sharing in terms of logic. They start to see, you need the same stuff I need. And that's where the real conformity can start happening. And the business can start working off this same page of music. And that's a big moment. One of the things that you realize in going through those exercises is that what you're building for the organization, I like to compare it with Lego bricks, right? So if you're just going to take this down a few notches technically, prior to this, what you have is just a bunch of plastic pellets. People are just trying to build stuff with plastic pellets. There's really nothing really to build. They got to melt it down, and someone's hand building some kind of dragon or something or car, and it's all a lot of work, right? Just like any kind of organization that is gathering from raw data and trying to build some kind of an analysis. It's a ton of work. What we're trying to do is build Lego bricks. We're trying to build logical components that say, hey, this is a customer, and these are all the elements that make up a customer. And hey, if you want to stack these bricks on top of each other to make a car, you can make a car. If you want to make a dragon, you can make a dragon. It's the same Lego bricks. You're not having to change the Lego bricks. Those are the same. I've had people tell me, oh man, that really solidified, that you guys aren't trying to build some like disparate piece of logic for us. These are just reusable components,
But I also think there is a lot to be said for the concept of COE. And again,
totally.
that phrase comes in, simplifying complexity. I think a lot of times governance is a carrot and a stick type of a mentality versus something that's really practical, something that people can do. It's like the third rail, don't touch the third rail. But in this case, we want governance to be something that everybody feels joyful to participate in, not yet another meeting on their calendar. When we did the webinar, I talked about the story when I was fortunate to be part of the at Nestle headquarters. We were together with Nestle and Nike, and I was part of Rolls-Royce delegation, and 3 totally different organizations that were part of very different cultures, very different practices, all trying to get to nirvana. And this is many years ago. The idea was that they were in different places within their journey, and their COEs were different because their journey was in a different place. And so this idea of how do we build up the COE and what skills do we have and what are the components of it, Snowflake is, I enjoy it sometimes as the nucleus of the reference of the COE. But there's a data science workbench on the right, and there's BI tools, the left and the right, sort of the yin and the yang of data governance and center of excellence.
Well, yeah, I actually like that a lot. It's got my wheels turning on, like, how can COE really get into that Snowflake world? I love it.
Well, I think it's really important to understand as an organization the type of COE that you can support. Right. Some organizations have built a centralized data team that is there to service the business. Right? My very first job out of college, I was a BI analyst at a small digital marketing firm, and all requests for data, all requests for reporting, all that came through us. And we would basically write the queries and put it out in this sort of pre-built query SQL injection engine that would then spit out a tabular report, which was just awful. But it was like that was the service that we provided, and we each kind of covered our own areas of the business, and we developed relationships. And so that's a very centralized COE type model where I own the data, I own the platform, I own the tools, and you send your requests to me, and I'll do that. Right? Completely valid COE model. Right.
Yeah,
and then there's the
ticket based.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's the far side, which is every line of business has their own IT section. Every line of business makes their own IT decisions. Every line of business holds their own kind of fiefdom. And there's not, and that's about, there's nothing in the center. It's all just kind of their own universe. And also completely valid for massive companies that have their own huge lines of, I think about like companies like GE, where like GE Healthcare has their own IT organization versus GE Aviation. Like those are 2 very different lines of business, and so super decentralized, and that's okay. But I'm a huge fan of the hub and spoke, which is that sort of small team at the center who owns the platform and the tools and the patterns. And all the lines of business have their own little fiefdoms in terms of the data itself, and building and then creating that communication avenue between the sort of centralized team and the different lines of business, and between the lines of business with each other, becomes a much faster way for advances to be made in an organization. Because now you're not reliant on a central system to get all the data in, to get in line and wait for me to deal with your request. You're not in a centralized way, and you're not duplicating work across all lines of business in a super decentralized way. Now this central team has built the we like to use the apartment building metaphor, right? We built the apartment building for you. You move whatever the hell you want into your apartment building. You want a 65-inch flat screen, bring it in, right? You want a tiny TV, bring it in. We don't care. You do what you want with your apartment. But we've built this structure and this community where now you guys can all have these conversations. So that's
but
so
you've provided the
for
shared
us.
Yeah, you've provided the shared services, you've provided the water, the electrical, and all those other things.
Exactly.
I think that's critical, because that hub and spoke model allows you to centralize those things that need to be centralized, like security and CI/CD policies and various things that deal with data engineering approaches. but you're not the only team that's doing the data engineering. You're following a template. You're following the methodology that's been established by a team that's tested these methodologies and continues to refine them based on what the spokes are bringing back.
Exactly. And the spokes can say, hey, we went out and thought that talent was a great tool, right? We really liked it. And this is the patterns that we brought in by using talent. The central team can say, yeah, that's great. Let's bring it in. Let's put it in as part of the assets in terms of ingestion. Let's make it an approved tool in the toolkit. Other parts of the business, all yours, right? And standardizing those patterns, those usage patterns helps a customer on their Snowflake journey to really accelerate at that point. Because
and that's one of the things. Well, I was good. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was saying now you're not redoing the work. Right now, you're learning from other people's mistakes, and you're learning from other people's final sort of successes as well.
And that's one of the things that we've really come to appreciate on the Snowflake end is that prior to that, you'd see this message of, hey, centralization, you can centralize, but you really couldn't. I mean, you couldn't even query some of these systems prior to Snowflake. We can actually query, an incredible amount of data in Snowflake. And because of that, it gives us the capacity to really open the pipeline to a whole bunch of different kinds of use cases. Because we don't have, any big limitations in front of us in terms of adopting a new department or what have you. The data itself is very, very scalable.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's interesting to say that, because one of the other value that we've talked a lot about is the ability to build out a data mesh, right? Your ability to create individual nodes for, maybe there's regulatory reasons why your team in Europe can't send the data, can't load that data into a data lake in the US. So you've always had to keep it separate, and there's never been any communication between that. But now in Snowflake, you can create a data mesh where there's a node in the EU where that data is there. And if you need to replicate certain pieces of it over to the US, you can do that very easily. And and you've made it that you can centralize without centralizing, right?
Yeah,
That's the key.
I think the other big piece of maturity has to do with skills, and we've talked about it certainly together. I think the challenge in the marketplace as folks are going through and exiting the Hadoop promise and exiting the promise of some of the other technologies that are currently darlings of the industry. There is a big challenge in the marketplace with skills and skilling resources and being able to leverage the tools that are now becoming available. And so while there are things on the data science side, this data mesh and this data cloud capability, the skills required to operate this data cloud are critically important. And so many organizations realize that they're missing 6 or 7 different skills. And when coming to Snowflake, realize that all I need is a single skill. I need to be able to know SQL. And so that's a big maturity optimization that we point out as part of our strategy work, because skills and cost of human capital is the biggest component that impacts our organizations, whether they're migrating or whether they're adopting. Yeah.
Totally.
It's funny. We were doing a workshop, and at the time, Arkady was showing how Snowflake processes data and whatnot. And one of the gentlemen there raised his hand and he said, well, I need to understand, so is Snowflake storing this in their own proprietary format? And, he was really into this concern about whether it was proprietary. And he says, so like, there's some kind of code back there that I can't see. Well, what's this coding language? And how am I going to be able to access it? And he says, well, it is in SQL. So you're going to have to really go a long way here.
folks were asking, because you have this blob storage layer, whether it's Azure, GCP, or AWS, you wanted to know, how do I get to these blobs? What do I do with these blobs? And the answer was SQL. SQL is the way you get to it.
Yeah. It's hard to accept for people that have, not lived in that world.
Yeah.
So
folks are thinking Athena and Presto and libraries and Arrow and pandas and all sorts of sparkly things. all you need is SQL, and that's the incredible part in terms of accelerating the adoption and reducing the learning curve.
Yeah, but Arkady got a chuckle out of the entire audience, because
I
everybody
mean,
could speak SQL.
Yeah, I mean, they teach SQL in college now.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
could hire any college graduate or even college dropout who took a SQL class, and they would be able to pick it up and understand what's going on. So I totally agree. But we also provide the capability that if you have developed these Spark skills and you have developed these Python skills and you have these models, great. Use our Python connector, use our Spark connector, right? Like that's what they're there for. We're here to be as mature, to your point, as you are capable of being. And it's funny when my team and I were having the conversations about maturity, one of the big areas that we had a big fight about was how does this compare to analytic maturity? In terms of the traditional analytical maturity curve, being able to be descriptive, predictive, all the way up, right?
Yeah.
And there's and that's where a lot of that skill set comes into play. And for us, the point I made is, look, you can get from new to modernizing, and your organization may not ever get past descriptive analytics. You might just not have that skill set, but you can still get all the value, all of what you need. And we've also enabled you to, if you want to have a pretty easy to use platform for your organization to accelerate yourself up the analytical maturity curve.
Yep.
Because your mindset has shifted and you understand, oh, these are assets, right? This is data assets now. And so we need to hire data scientists. We need to do that. And so, even if you get all the way to modernizing in terms of a customer journey on Snowflake, you don't necessarily have to you don't have to then be prescriptive. It's not automatic, you're not automatically going to be doing prescriptive analytics, but you're going to be enabled to do that. And that's such a huge value. And, and especially once you get past the expanding phase and you get into what we call the standardizing phase. And all of a sudden the question across the organization isn't, why are we using Snowflake for this use case? It's, why aren't you using Snowflake for this use case? Like why aren't we talking about Snowflake in this case? And that's so critical for us, because then it turns from proving to optimizing. And we want to optimize what you're doing, and we want to optimize not only your performance on Snowflake, but we also want to optimize your usage of the data cloud and your organization, right? We want to optimize how you're doing all those things. And so, and at that point, you're publishing and consuming assets, right? You're doing all of that.
Yeah, and when we were talking about this, I ended up skipping that phase mostly because I could feel that was more of the organization's own realization, and I was trying to get to like, all right, what are, from total consultant's perspective, right? Like, what do we got to do technically to get this to happen? And obviously, in fact, especially this conversation on the COE stuff, I think there's some really interesting points there that I'm gonna pick Arkady's ear on afterwards. Yeah. But I'm seeing, if you can do something as part of the COE to impact that mentality, to really get people to start, to stop thinking about their previous world of data islands everywhere, and really start thinking about, we have a data platform, and it works. It's scalable. We can query the heck out of it. We know how to manage it. It's a standard that's not difficult to adopt. So why aren't we using it? So I can see the value of it, especially with the COE setup.
Especially as we talk about COE, I think one of the critical things to also touch on is the fact that many organizations are going through a process re-engineering journeys, whether it's Six Sigma or adopting Lean. Those practices are being adopted at the executive layer. And the conversations around data cloud are sometimes happening within the IT layer. And I think that's a big disconnect from a maturity perspective, because the fact that there is Snowflake as part of this conversation, the fact that you have a data cloud is part of your enterprise maturity. It's part of your enterprise, not just the architecture, not just the IT-centric, ITIL type discussions, but it's part of it changes your ability to go to market. It changes your ability to be agile. It changes your ability to be effective. It changes your cost structure. So these conversations, and folks who are, participating live or listening to the recording of this, most of them are in the IT and IT management role and are having a difficult time communicating to the executive team how this impacts organizational maturity. Because I think all of our conversations, and I want to make sure that everybody understands this, have been around organizational maturity, not just how do you mature because you've got one technology versus another.
Right.
Yeah, and our ability to influence that is how we do our jobs best, and our ability to get at that executive layer and get them to understand what does the data cloud mean for you as an enterprise. And the key component of this is there are some organizations who just are not going to share their data, period. Right. There might be regulatory reasons. It might just not be that interesting of data that they know that just they're not going to get any return on it. But for me, we talk about data as an asset and the data cloud, and I like to call it the data economy. Right? We've built this data economy within Snowflake, and it's a macro economy. Right? It's a global. It's a global company to company complete macro economy. You could almost study it in a macroeconomics class. But an organization who is not going to be part of the macroeconomy for any number of reasons, they could absolutely still get a hell of a lot of value of the data economy, but it's their own microeconomy, right? An organization may have built a data microeconomy using a private data exchange or just a strong governance tool, and something, trading assets and trading services across lines of business is going to drive value for an enterprise. And so building out your own, insert company name here, data cloud, right? You're already realizing the vision, and you're already going through that transformation. And
so James, I have a product enhancement that you've thought of just now without even expressing it in such terms, and that is take what you have on the marketplace, and make a private version of it that customers can own and manage and curate, and
you should all tune in to the Snowflake Summit. Okay. Registration is right here. Please,
all right. Yeah, we'll be there.
Feel free to register, and you might be surprised at what you hear, Jared.
I'm impressed you figured out what side of the screen it's on.
Don't get me wrong. I've been pointing at this for a couple of weeks.
Okay.
So I know exactly which arm and where I'm supposed to be.
But that's actually the as far as the next stage I have on mine is just the enrichment stage. Being able to go, of course, in this case, externally, but at least in my description of the stage, is being able to go externally and acquire these data sets that other companies have provided. I call it the enrichment stage, but it's, we have one of our customers that has used the COVID-19 set as well. And one thing that's interesting about that, most people, when they think about some kind of a data sharing or data exchange scenario, they think of it as like this long-term, like for 10 years, they're going to be exchanging data.
Yeah.
But what makes the exchange so compelling is that it doesn't have to be that. You could have a very tactical need for a piece of data that's shared out on the marketplace, and the duration to onboard that is I'll tell you what she told me. This is one of our customers. She said the first time that we would go look at the COVID-19 set, I sent an email out to one of my colleagues and I said, hey, take a look at this, see what it would take to bring it in, and how much work effort is involved here. And she was expecting to get an email like the following week on the progress. And she got an email back in 45 minutes saying, well, it's the data set's here. Here's the connection. And she was like blown away. She's like, it really is that simple and she said the only reason it took 45 minutes because it's the first time she'd ever done it. She said, had she been doing it multiple times, we'd probably have connected. She says, I would have just connected to it myself.
Yeah.
It's not that difficult. So
and we're working with a number of providers who have API endpoints and RESTful API endpoints, and that data set is difficult to get to for doing analytics because you're sort of one API lookup at a time, and wrapping that and making that available through the Snowflake data share. And again, it could be a private share or it could be a public share, but the time to market is dramatically different. And again, those are the expectations that need to change and as the maturity curve and adoption curve changes as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're having a lot of conversations with customers who have built customer facing apps that revolve around data, and they're thinking about moving those to Snowflake, and we're doing a big push with a lot of our customers in our Powered by Snowflake program around building applications. But one of the first questions that we get is, hey, do you have APIs? And we're like, okay, I don't think you understand what we're trying to do here. And so my first question back is, okay, what are you using these APIs for? Are you using them to connect your application back to Snowflake and do? Great, let's talk about the APIs. Are you making them available to your customers to then get at data? Well, let's have a conversation about data sharing and reader accounts, right? They might say, oh, well, our customers aren't necessarily Snowflake customers. And the answer is give them a reader account. No problem. Right? You can make a reader account, and it's the same. And that you pay for the consumption. You can charge it back to the customer. You can do whatever you want. And getting them to think about that is really when you've hit that modernizing. Right?
And how amazing it is to allow them to just issue SQL queries, not some like ethereal third-party app layer, just a SQL query. Bam. That's huge.
But there's definitely some use cases where we've got mobile or real-time API access that's required. The question then becomes, how do you bake those data assets? How do you prepare those data assets? And so Snowflake, in our case, in that reference architecture, we do all of the heavy lifting, all of that munging and all of that heavy lifting that normally would be taken out and then brought back in. And then we provide a easy RESTful endpoint that is available in real time and scales elastically, just like Snowflake does. But that layer is very thin versus building out this big infrastructure to manage all of this data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, more and more in the application space, microservices is the way to go. Fit for purpose databases that run your transactional pieces of your database. Snowflake is not your transactional data layer. We're not gonna tell you that we are. At least not yet. There's again, have a good time at Summit.
Yeah.
And there's that microservices architecture lends very well to a Snowflake backend because to your point, Arkady, Snowflake can be the engine through which you derive better insights and then make that available to all of your applications rather than having to build logic for one application and then try to replicate that logic from application to application on the data that they're bringing in, right? You create this central repository that then does all the munging and all the whatever, and then you send it back out as needed, or somebody can hit it directly if they, depending on your particular use case. But that microservices model lends itself very well to Snowflake. But at the end of the day, you kind of hit that point, Jared, very well on the for me talking about modernizing is once you're actually in you talking about enrichment, to me they're one and the same thing. You've now put yourself in a position to get better value out of your assets and to continue to drive better and better ROI against your data assets, whether that's bringing in new data to enrich, sharing data with your partners, getting data sets you hadn't even thought about, and you've now put all your data in this one network, in this one global network that can be shared and replicated and across to anybody in your organization who needs data or data services. You can really begin a digital and data transformation.
Yeah,
right? We don't like to call a customer, okay, you're mature. right? Great, we
Yeah,
made
yeah.
it to the mature. No. This is a never-ending journey.
Mhm.
But you've fully realized the vision of the data cloud, and you are taking advantage of it. And
Yeah.
my job turns from selling you on the vision to helping you understand how new features and new products and new data sets that are available and new customers that have come on board can become better assets for you.
Right.
We talk about sort of this gracefully extensible architecture, and so we add components as we need to add. And when that discussion takes place, a lot of times the question is, when will I be done? And so one of the things that we've described, and it's less about how long Intricity will be there, it's the journey that this organization needs to be on. And we've described it as a journey rather than a destination. Because again, maturity is, you will continuously improve your processes, you'll continuously improve your products, you'll continuously improve those things that make you unique. Data and your data journey is no different.
Yeah, so there's two more stages that I have on mine. I don't know how many you guys have on yours.
We're all done. We only stick
really?
with 5. We keep it nice and tight.
Well, one of my last ones, the last two was the association stage. So the association stage is an important one for us because once you've got all of this and you've got all of these users, and the larger this gets, now this often happens right out of the gate. It happens with the larger customers. The association stage happens right out of the gate. There's no way to avoid it. But it's this concept of, I need to be able to associate all my users to this incredible amount of content that now has been centralized in my organization. It's almost like now I need to actually govern these two parties. And so we spend a lot of time on that topic, particularly with some of these really, really large organizations that have employee bases in the hundreds of thousands of people. Being able to map data to people becomes super, super important. And I realize it's sort of late in the maturity discussion, and it would seem that you would do that, up front, but there's a lot of value to glean from Snowflake as you're going along. And so it's not uncommon for organizations to get to a certain point and go, holy cow, we've got to organize this massive centralization that we've come across. And then the last one that I have is sharing and marketability, which is, how do I, now that I've governed all this, I've got all of this stuff, now I want to share it. I want to be a participant in the marketplace. When we talk about new products, we talk about it in the framework of how does sharing our data increase the marketability of our tool, or and whatnot. So those are my last two.
Yeah, no, those are good.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that those I can see on a professional services world why those are incredibly important, because for us, we're providing a platform for you to do all these things. But some organizations, they can get to modernizing and still not quite know how to do that, right? And we're all very smart people, but we're not necessarily going to be the organizational change managers that you need in order to do that. And I think I can totally understand from an Intricity perspective, you need those last two phases, because that's really where the organizational adoption comes into play, and why we rely so heavily on our partners to help us with that, because we can't be successful if there's not a good adoption going on across the board, and an organization can't be successful if there's not adoption going on, getting their organizations on board and getting their partners on board, right, and getting their customers on board. If they can't sell to their customers their data sets, then they will have gone through this whole process and then have all these really phenomenal assets that they can't do anything about. So I can totally understand how they would need help with that.
Yeah. So James, I want to thank you for joining us for Data Sharks. It was great having you on. And for all the viewers, like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification button, which I think is a little bell on YouTube. And if you go to intricity.com/datasharks, there's a giveaway for some Apple AirPod Maxes there. So every 6 months we do the raffle. So Be sure and subscribe there, and you'll be able to be in the running. Again, James, thank you so much. Arkady, also
Thank you, James.
very much.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Jared.
absolutely. Thanks for
All
having
right.
me.
Very good. We'll catch you all later.
Take
Thanks
care.
much.